Good evening, good Vok Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my lovely sisters and brothers. Great to be starting the week learning with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Melissa and Great Night Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Frank in San Pedro, Ella in Southern California. Welcome everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by Judy Silberberg for the healing of IDF soldiers wounded on and following October 7th, 2023. Amen. May they all have a refuah shlema. And Judy, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. In the merit of that, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in Tractate Menachos. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 1 in Tractate Menachos, the 30th volume of the Talmud. Today we'll complete that Mishnah and open Mishnah number 2, God willing. We're picking this up at the bottom of page 5b. Our daf is daf vav, page 6, here in Tractate Menachos. Rav Ada bar Abba said that this is the response mentioned in the Baraisa. The law that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice must be derived from a verse because it can be said that the prohibition against diverse kinds proves that the law of a treifa cannot be derived from a kal v'chomer inference. So as you recall yesterday, we went through one proof after another. The concept, and it's interesting, our Rav had talked about this today in Shul today. I don't know if it's the first, but an important example of a kal v'chomer in the Torah was in this week's Parsha. I mean, now we're into Parshas Bo, but last week was Parshas Va'era. And the concept was when Moses said to God, why will Pharaoh listen to me? The people don't even listen to me. Even the Jews don't listen to me. Or rather, the Jews aren't listening to my voice. How much more will Paro, who, I'm here to tell the Jews you're going to be free. They don't want to listen to me. How much more will Paro not listen to me, who has so much to lose by losing the work product of the Jewish people as his slaves, right? That's a kal v'chomer inference. How much more from one situation to another. So the kal v'chomer that was posited here for the treifa, the animal that has a wound that will cause it to die within 12 months, and therefore we can't offer it up on the altar, when something like this, if a blemished animal, which people can eat, nevertheless is unfit to be offered on the altar as a sacrifice to the Most High, How much more a treifa, which is unfit for people to eat, how much more so is it unfit to offer it on the altar? Therefore, we would know through a kal v'chomer inference from the law of the blemished animal that it can't be offered, that a treifa cannot be offered. But that kal v'chomer was rejected by the Gemara and by the sages over and over, because there are certain things that are unfit for people, but nevertheless are fit for the altar. So, for example, the chalev, right, which is the fatty part of an animal that we don't eat, right? It's not kosher to eat that part of the animal, and yet in a burnt offering, it goes along with the rest of the animal and is offered up on the altar. Therefore, we can't rely on the kal v'chomer to prove that the treifa is unfit for the altar, and that's why we rely on a verse. The Torah doesn't say explicitly that you can't offer a treifa on the altar, but what it does say is that you have to take from your best, right? It's from, the things that are yours to use, which are your best pasture land, your best, etc. That's what the verse implied. And that would suggest that something that is prohibited to us can't be put on the altar, and that's the verse we rely on to say that a treifa is prohibited. However, the sages are not done saying that, yes, well, there's a difference between the kal v'chomer that involves chalev and the kal v'chomer that involves a treifa. The chalev came from an animal that was permitted. The treifa never was permitted. And so they're suggesting other ways to get at a kal v'chomer that works. Or if it doesn't work, another proof why it doesn't work, and therefore we must rely on the verse. So again, Rabba bar Abba said that this is the response mentioned in the Baraisa. The law that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice must be derived from a verse, because it can be said that the prohibition against diverse kinds, kilayim, right? So kilayim means you can't, for example, grow wheat in a vineyard, proves that the law of a treifa cannot be derived from the kal v'chomer inference, as it is prohibited for an ordinary person to wear garments sewn from a mixture of diverse kinds, right? You can't wear a garment made of wool and linen. And yet, wool and linen is permitted when it comes to the sash of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest. It's actually commanded. Right? It is prohibited for an ordinary person to wear garments sewn from a mixture of diverse kinds, wool and linen, and yet such garments are permitted for the Most High, as the belt of the priestly vestments was fashioned from a mixture of diverse kinds. And so the Gemara rejects this, right? That sounds like the chalev, we can't eat it, but the altar can. But wait a minute, what is notable about the prohibition against kilayim? It is notable in that the general prohibition against wearing a garment sewn from diverse kinds was permitted in the case of an ordinary person with regard to tzitzis, right? Because tzitzis are made out of wool, but if you had a four-cornered garment that was made out of linen, you would still have to attach tzitzis to it. So therefore, in that situation, we have an exception to the law against shatnez, right, against diverse kinds of wool and linen. You would then have a garment even for an ordinary person. As a string of sky blue wool must be placed on a four-cornered garment, even if that garment was made of linen. And the Gemara asks, is that to say that ritual fringes, that tzitzis, are considered a requirement of an ordinary person whose performance was exempted from the general prohibition concerning diverse kinds with regard to one's private needs? Right? Are we saying that it's permitted for us to wear wool and linen because we want to wear wool and linen? No, we have to put that in this case, not for just general wool and linen, but because the techelis is on a wool string in the tzitzis by commandment. That's why we put it even on a linen garment. Placing tzitzis on a garment is a mitzvah. Rather, the claim of Rav Ada bar Abba can be refuted in a different way. Now we're at the top of 6a. What is notable about kilayim, like diverse kinds, whether wool and linen, or plowing with an ox and a donkey together, or growing wheat in a vineyard, right? That's the prohibition against diverse kinds. It is notable in that its mitzvah is in this manner, since the belt of the priestly vestments must be sown from diverse kinds. Yes, that's commanded. But when you come back to the treifa, is there any situation in which we're commanded to use a treifa? No, of course not. And therefore, it's no good for eating and it's no good for the altar. Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said the law that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice must be derived from a verse, because it can be said, let this claim be derived by analogy from the common element of two sources, as follows. With regard to the question of the Baraisa, what is notable about melika, the way that we kill a bird in order to offer it as a sacrifice? And that's the only way a bird can be killed if it's being offered as a sacrifice. But melika is not a valid method of killing a bird if we're going to eat it for our chicken dinner. Then the chicken has to be shechted, slaughtered with a blade. So melika is only for birds when they're being offered as a sacrifice. So with regard to the question of the Brisa, what is notable about melika? It is notable in that its sanctity prohibits it. In other words, because you are bringing it as an offering, you're going to kill it with melika. Once you've killed it with melika, it can't ever be eaten by a human because it was not shechted. Right? What is notable about melika? It is notable in that its sanctity prohibits it. So one can respond, yes, but chelev and dam, right, the prohibited parts of a kosher animal, that nevertheless we eat the meat, but we can't eat neither its blood nor its forbidden fat. So chelev and dam prove that this consideration is not enough to reject the kal v'chomer inference, as these are prohibited before they are sanctified and are nevertheless permitted for the Most High, since they do go up along with the animal in a burnt offering, in an ola on the altar. And similarly, with regard to the question, what is notable about chelev and dam, fat and blood, they are notable in that they come from an item that is generally permitted, i.e. the animal from which they come is itself permitted for consumption, comes from a kosher animal that was slaughtered in a kosher manner, so we can eat the meat, but not the blood and the fat. So to this, one can reply, melika proves that this consideration is insufficient for rejection of the kal v'chomer inference, as a bird that was killed by melika is entirely prohibited for eating, and yet a bird that was killed by melika is valid for the altar. So that's a situation where prohibited to us, permitted to the altar, that would seem to discredit the kal v'chomer about a treifa. Prohibited to us, so is it permitted for the altar? We say no, because of the kal v'chomer comparing it to a blemished animal, but this law of chelev and dam would suggest that the kal v'chomer is inadequate. That's why we need a verse, because we have an example of something that's prohibited to us and permitted for the altar. We can't say that because it's prohibited to us, the treifa is prohibited to the altar. Rav Shesha concludes, and accordingly, the inference has reverted to its starting point. The aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that they are prohibited for consumption to an ordinary person and are nevertheless permitted for the Most High. Therefore, I will also bring the case of the treifa and say, even though it is prohibited for consumption to an ordinary person, it should be permitted for the Most High. It is therefore necessary to derive from a verse that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice. So the Gemara rejects this proof. What is notable about their common element? It is notable in that with regard to fat and blood and pinching in melika, right, chelev and dam, right, fat and blood, and the law of melika, both of which, right, prohibited to a person, permitted to the altar. What is notable about their common element? It is notable that with regard to chelev and dam and melika, in both cases, its mitzvah is performed in this manner. It is a mitzvah to remove the chelev and the dam from food that we're eating. It is a mitzvah to include it when an ola is being brought on the altar. It is a mitzvah to kill a bird in that manner if it's being offered as a sacrifice. It's never a mitzvah to create a treifa. You don't wound an animal to make it a treifa. Treifa has no mitzvah associated with it other than the negative prohibition not to eat it. Therefore, it can't serve as a kal v'chomer, and that's why we need. What they're saying is a treifa is different than melika, dam, and chalev. Therefore, the kal v'chomer might work. Your reason for not using the kal v'chomer doesn't work because those laws are too different from the law of the treifa. So we haven't disproved the kal v'chomer, and they're still looking for a slam dunk refutation of the kal v'chomer argument. So, rather, Rav Ashi said it is necessary to derive the law of a treifa from a verse because, right now can he come up with a slam dunk reason why the kal v'chomer doesn't work? Because one can say that the refutation of the kal v'chomer is present from the outset. Rav Ashi explains, from where do you wish to derive the law that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice? You wish to derive it from a kal v'chomer inference from the case of a blemished animal, as a blemished animal is permitted for people to eat and prohibited for sacrifice on the altar. But this is problematic. Says Rav Ashi, what is notable about a blemished animal? It is notable in that, with regard to blemishes, the Torah rendered those who sacrifice like that which is sacrificed. What does he mean? A blemished priest may not sacrifice an offering, just as a blemished animal is unfit for sacrifice, right? We learned that at Leviticus chapter 22. If a Kohen serving the temple has certain visible blemishes on his body, he is going to be disqualified from bringing offerings. If it's a temporary blemish, while the blemish exists, once he gets better from it, he can start bringing sacrifices again. And if it's a permanent blemish, okay, so this Kohen cannot serve in the temple by bringing sacrifices. He can eat of sacrifices, but he can't bring them. Now, this cannot be said with regard to a treifa, as a priest with a wound that will cause him to die within 12 months may perform the temple service, right? A wound that makes an animal a treifa is usually an internal wound, like a needle through its lung. If a human had that, outwardly he would not be blemished. So even though he had that internal wound, if he was still up and around and able to bring offerings, he could bring offerings. So while the human version of a blemish would disqualify the priest just as it disqualifies the animal being brought as a sacrifice, the human version of a treifa would not disqualify the priest. Therefore, this kal v'chomer doesn't work from the get-go. Right? It is therefore necessary to derive from the verse the fact that a treifa is unfit for service. This kal v'chomer never worked to begin with. Rav Achasava said to Rav Ashi, but an animal born by cesarean section proves that this kal v'chomer inference cannot be rejected based on this argument that Rav Ashi just made. As with regard to it, the Torah did not render those who sacrifice like that which is sacrificed, since an animal born by cesarean section is unfit for sacrifice, whereas a priest born in such a manner may perform the temple service. And yet, an animal born by cesarean section is permitted for consumption to an ordinary person and prohibited for the altar. If so, one cannot reject the kal v'chomer inference because with regard to blemishes, the Torah rendered those who sacrifice like that which is sacrificed. Why then is a verse necessary in order to derive that a treifa is unfit? Sounds like this is an argument to bring our kal v'chomer back into play. But Rav Ashi answers, what is notable about an animal born by cesarean section? It is notable in that such an animal is not sanctified with firstborn status. Right? A bechor is when a female kosher animal, its first young that emerges from its womb is a male, so that's a bechor. Bechor has to be brought as a sacrifice of the firstborn. If it's a female, it's not born that way. But if the first animal that emerges from this female kosher animal is a male born by cesarean section, it does not have bechor status. Whereas a firstborn animal that was born as a treifa is sanctified. Accordingly, without the verse, one might have concluded that a treifa may be sacrificed. So the fact that a firstborn male of a female kosher animal is born as a treifa it's interesting that it is sanctified. What they mean is it won't be able to be offered because it's a treifa, but nevertheless, it has bechor status. So you're going to have to dispose of it in a way that would be different than if it was not a bechor. Now, Rav Acha Sava answers, a blemished animal proves that this is not the decisive consideration, as it does become sanctified with the sanctity of a firstborn, and it too is permitted for consumption and prohibited for the Most High. And if you say, what is notable about a blemished animal? It is notable in that with regard to it, the Torah rendered those who sacrifice like that which is sacrificed. One can respond, an animal born by cesarean section proves that this consideration is not decisive, as a priest born by cesarean section may perform the temple service. Tough material. The thing to remember is this is really an exercise. If you ever took a class in logic, right, whether a philosophy class or a mathematics class, if A, then B, if A and B, then C. But wait, A and B are not related to each other, so maybe we can't get to C. In other words, they're really examining with a fine instrument, like a microscope, whether the logic of one situation can extend to the other, because even though the two situations are similar and seemingly only have one difference, that we can use logic to bridge the divide. If you can introduce or you can observe two differences, then the logic won't bridge the divide. And that's what they keep finding. Right? So Rav Acha Sava concludes, and therefore the inference has reverted to its starting point. The aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. The common element is that they are permitted for consumption to an ordinary person and prohibited for the Most High, cesarean section or blemished. And all the more so, a treifa, which is prohibited to an ordinary person, should be prohibited for the Most High. If so, the derivation from a verse is unnecessary. This would suggest that the Kal V'chomer works comparing blemished animals to a treifa, but Rav Ashi won't agree. Rav Ashi refutes the proof of Rav Acha Sava. What is notable about their common element? It is notable in that their general prohibition was not permitted, since blemished animals and those born by cesarean section were never permitted for sacrifice. Will you say the same applies to a treifa? The treifa started as a regular animal. It became a treifa. There was a time when it was fit. Once it became a treifa, it was unfit. That makes it different than an animal that was born and disqualified to be brought as an offering. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ava, said to Rav Ashi, this treifa, whose general prohibition was permitted, what is it? I.e., to what case is this referring? If we say that it is referring to the melika of a bird burnt offering for the Most High, whereby the bird is initially rendered a treifa at the start of the process, the melika makes it a treifa, and nevertheless, it is sacrificed upon the altar, then the same may be said of a blemished animal as well. As with regard to animals, it is permitted to sacrifice a blemished bird. I mean, it's very interesting. With this we haven't talked about yet, that the idea that when you perform melika on a bird, you've made it a treifa. I mean, you kill the bird, right? It's like its head is going to come off and the blood is pouring out of it. But I guess what they're saying is that the beginning of melika makes it a treifa, and yet you continue killing it and nevertheless offer its blood. Right? So a real subtle nuance here. And they're going to say, well, isn't that the same of a blemish? Like when you're shechting an animal, aren't you causing a blemish when you begin to shecht it, and yet you finish the shechting and bring it as an offering? As with regard to birds, it is permitted to sacrifice a blemished bird. This is in accordance with the law that the requirement that an offering must be unblemished and male applies to animal offerings, but there is no requirement that an offering must be unblemished and male in the case of bird offerings. So rather, this permitting the general prohibition found in the context of a treifa is referring to the law that the melika of a bird sin offering renders it permitted to the priest for consumption, despite the fact that it was not slaughtered by cutting its neck with a knife. Here they're saying that in a bird sin offering, part of it, I guess, is eaten by the priests, even though it was not shechted. Normally, we can't eat any kind of bird, whether any kind of meat, whether mammal meat or bird meat if it was not shechted. But in the case of a bird sin offering, where the proper method of killing it is melika, nevertheless, part of it can be consumed by the priest, even though it was not shechted. This claim can be refuted as well, as the priests receive their portion from the table of the Most High, i.e., they may partake of the sin offering only because it was permitted for sacrifice upon the altar. Accordingly, there is no difference between a treifa due to melika and a blemished bird, as both were released from their general prohibition in this regard, since both are permitted for sacrifice upon the altar, and both are therefore permitted for consumption by the priests. Consequently, the kal v'chomer inference remains valid, which would suggest we don't need a verse in order to derive that a treifa is prohibited for the altar. We could derive it from, going back to our kal v'chomer, we can eat blemished birds, but they're no good for the altar. And how much more a treifa, which we can't eat, must it be obviously prohibited for the altar? Now we're saying the kal v'chomer does work. But here's another argument for refuting the kal v'chomer, like this. What is notable about the common element of this melika situation? It is notable in that, with regard to both a blemished animal and one born by cesarean section, their blemish is noticeable. As a blemished animal is visibly blemished, and it is well known that an animal is born by cesarean section. Interesting. I mean, you couldn't tell by looking at the animal, but I guess it would be known about the history of the animal. Will you say that they can serve as the source of the law of a treifa, whose blemish is not necessarily noticeable? It's usually an internal injury that we don't even find out about until we check the animal. And it is due to that reason that the verse of the herd was necessary to teach that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice. We can't use the kal v'chomer. There's too many differences between a treifa and other animals from which we might have derived the kal v'chomer inference, and therefore we needed a verse to tell us that the treifa is unfit for the altar. Says the Gemara, after trying to prove why a derivation from a verse is necessary, the Gemara questions the very source provided by the Baraisa on page 5b for the disqualification of a treifa. In other words, okay, we've arrived at the conclusion after examining the arguments of a whole lot of sages that the kal v'chomer argument doesn't work. So we need a verse to establish the law that a treifa cannot be offered up on the altar. And the verse that was used was... is it here? The verse was right that you must sacrifice from the well-watered pastures of Israel, which suggests only things that are permitted to you are going to be permitted to the altar in general, although that wasn't true of chaylev and dam, but chaylev and dam come from an animal that was permitted to us, even though we don't eat those parts of it. We do eat the rest of the animal. That's why that works as a verse. But now the Gemara is saying, wait a minute, is that the right verse? Maybe there's a different verse which will be a better source for us to prove that a treifa is prohibited to the altar. So after trying to prove why derivation from a verse is necessary, the Gemara questions the very source provided by the Baraisa on 5b for the disqualification of a treifa, i.e. the verse of the herd in Leviticus 1:3. But is the law that a treifa is unfit for sacrifice derived from here? It is derived from there, i.e. from the verse from the well-watered pastures of Israel in Ezekiel 45:15, from which it is derived that an offering may be brought only from that which is permitted to the Jewish people. Alternatively, this law can be derived from a verse discussing animal tithe offerings, right? 1/10 of all the newborns, that's the animal tithe. They're brought to Jerusalem when the temple is standing. Like a peace offering, they're slaughtered at the temple but eaten by their owners, sort of like a Meiser Sheni as well. With regard to that law, it says in Leviticus 27:32, whatever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy for the Lord. That's how you do the animal tithe offering, passing the animals under the newborns of that season under the rod, and every 10th is marked. This teaches that all animals may be sacrificed as the animal tithe to the exclusion of a treifa, as it does not pass under the rod on account of its weakness. And the sages derive from this the law that a treifa is unfit for any type of offering. Interesting. because there's definitely treifas that can pass under the rod. Their wound is not yet so severe. We don't even know it was a treifa until we shechted it and opened it up. But what they're saying is symbolically, it has a wound that will kill it within a year, and so passing under the rod, again, symbolically doesn't work for it. Even if it did make it under the rod, it didn't get under the same way as a healthy animal. Now, the Gemara responds, all of these verses are necessary because if the disqualification of a treifa was derived from the verse, the well-watered pastures of Israel, I would say that this verse serves to exclude a treifa only in a case where it did not have a period of fitness. For example, if it was born as a treifa and it was therefore never fit for sacrifice. Maybe we exclude that kind of a treifa, but we don't exclude an animal that became a treifa. This is similar to the case of the fruit of a tree during the first 3 years of its planting. Orla, right? We can't eat fruit from trees in their first 3 years. That's the prohibition on orla. And kilayim, diverse kinds planted in a vineyard, whose disqualification is derived from this verse. But with regard to a treifa that had a period of fitness, one might say that it should be fit. Therefore, the merciful one writes, whatever passes under the rod, to teach that all animals that do not pass under the rod are unfit for sacrifice, even if they were once fit. And the Gemara continues, and if the merciful one had written only whatever passes under the rod, I would say that this verse serves to exclude a treifa only where it was rendered a treifa and its owners subsequently sanctified it. This is similar to the case of animal tithes, as this verse is teaching that a treifa cannot be subsequently sanctified as a tithe. But if the owner sanctified it and it was subsequently rendered a treifa, which means that at the time when it was sanctified it was fit, one might have thought that it should remain fit. Therefore, the merciful one wrote of the herd to teach that even an animal that became a treifa after it was already sanctified is nevertheless unfit for sacrifice. Accordingly, all three verses are necessary to cover different situations: born a treifa, born fit, and then became a treifa, born fit, and then was sanctified, and then became a treifa. In all three cases, unfit for the altar, and we needed the three verses to tell us that. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Menachos. We move on to Mishnah number 2. Both the meal offering of a sinner and all other meal offerings with regard to which one who removed their handful was a non-priest, or a priest who was an acute mourner, i.e. whose relative died and was not yet buried, or a priest who was ritually impure, tameh, even if he immersed that day, but he was waiting nightfall to become pure again, that's called the tevel yom, or a priest lacking the requisite priestly vestments, right? He's not dressed in the priestly vestments, or a priest who had not yet brought an atonement offering to complete the purification process, for example, if he'd been a Mitzorah, or a priest who did not wash his hands and feet from the water in the basin prior to performing the temple service, or a priest who is not circumcised, or a priest who is tameh for any reason, ritually impure, or a priest who removed the handful while sitting, or while standing, but not on the floor of the temple, rather on some other vessel, or if he was standing upon an animal, or if he was standing on the feet of another person. In all these cases, the meal offering is unfit for sacrifice. Right? The priest was disqualified for any of these reasons. Right now, we're not talking about a disqualification of the meal offering or a disqualification because the priest had some other meal offering in mind at the time that he took the handful from the flour, right? F-L-O-U-R, the flour. He has to take it in the kametz, special, scoop it with these 3 fingers and then scrape off the excess with his pinky and thumb. But if at the time that he did that, a non-priest did it, or a tameh priest did it, or a priest who wasn't standing up, or he didn't have his feet on the floor, or any of these other reasons, that would disqualify the meal offering. If the priest removed the handful with his left hand, the meal offering is unfit. Ben Beseira says he must return the handful to the vessel that contains the meal offering and again remove the handful, this time with his right hand. Right? So Ben Beseira's view is more lenient in that there's a cure. If he took it out with his left hand, okay, put it back in and now take it out with your right hand and the meal offering is still qualified. Sounds like the majority would say if he took it out with his left hand, renders the whole meal offering disqualified. They're going to have to get another a portion of flour for a meal offering and start over. If a priest removed the handful of flour and the stone, a grain of salt, or a chorus, meaning a pinch of frankincense, emerged in his hand, the meal offering is unfit due to the fact that the sages said the handful that is outsized or that is lacking is unfit. And the existence of one of these foreign items in the handful of flour from the meal offering means that the requisite measure of flour is lacking. Now, even though different priests have different size hands, the fact is, for the priest who's taking it, that's the right measure. And if there was other stuff in it, then it's lacking because there's other stuff in it. And which is the outsized handful, right? What is too big? It is one where he removed the handful overflowing in a manner in which his fingers do not hold the flour, right? It was like a little bit too much, and it was just, he got it out, but it's not stable. And which is the lacking handful? It is one where he removed the handful with the tips of his fingers, too little of it. That's the Mishnah, Mishnah number 2. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, why do I need the Mishnah to teach both the meal offering of a sinner and all other meal offerings? Right? If they're all disqualified by the same factors, why are we saying both the meal offering of the sinner and all other meal offerings? Why didn't it just say all meal offerings are disqualified by these factors, right? Why do I need the Mishnah to teach both the meal offering of a sinner and all other meal offerings? Let it teach instead all the meal offerings with regard to which one removed their handful by a non-priest or acute mourner, etc. Why does the Mishnah single out the case of the meal offering of a sinner? And the Gemara answers, it was necessary for the Mishnah to teach this law in this manner in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. As it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says, by right, the meal offering of a sinner should require oil and frankincense, like all other meal offerings, so that the sinner will not profit. Right? The sinner brings a humbler offering than other people who are bringing a meal offering, and that his meal offering is pure flour. Other meal offerings have oil and frankincense mixed into them. Rabbi Shimon is saying, well, he's getting off easy. He doesn't have to pay for oil and frankincense. So by rights, it should have included those other things, so that he not profit by his sin. Right? It should have. It says by right, the meal offering of a sinner should require oil and frankincense like other meal offerings, so that the sinner will not profit. And for what reason does it not require oil and frankincense? So that his offering will not be of superior quality. Right? He's being reminded that he's a sinner because he's bringing a more humble offering. And likewise, by right, the sin offering of forbidden fat, i.e. the offering brought by one who unwittingly ate the forbidden fat of a domesticated animal, should require libations so that the sinner will not profit. And for what reason does this offering not require libations? So that his offering will not be of superior quality. Accordingly, it might enter your mind to say that since Rabbi Shimon says, in order that his offering will not be of superior quality, when the handful is removed by one of those unfit for performing the temple service, the offering should also be valid, as it too is of inferior quality. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us the law in a manner that emphasizes that even according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, the meal offering of a sinner is disqualified when the handful is removed by one who is himself unfit. We are on page 6b now. Now the Gemara asks, if so, then there as well, i.e. with regard to the slaughtered offerings, let the Mishnah that we read in Tractate Zevachim, the previous tractate about animal offerings that are shechted, that Mishnah should have taught both the sin offering of forbidden fat and all the slaughtered offerings with regard to which one who collected their blood, who was a non-priest or a priest who was an acute mourner, are disqualified. And let us say that it was necessary to teach the Mishnah in the manner in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon to emphasize that although the sin offering is not of superior quality and that it does not require that libations be brought with it, nevertheless it is disqualified if its blood was collected by one unfit for the temple service, right? Why wasn't that Mishnah, which had the same kind of disqualification of an offering because it was brought by an unfit priest, why did it not also specify that sin offerings would be rendered unfit in the same way for the same reasoning to say that even according to Rabbi Shimon, because that Mishnah, which is analogous to this one, about meal offerings is analogous to that one about animal offerings in Tractate Zevachim, but that one about animal offerings in Tractate Zevachim did not say sin offerings and all other offerings are disqualified if brought by an unfit priest. Why not? Why not? So the Gemara concludes its question, apparently, since the Tana teaches that Mishnah with the term all, and he does not teach except, all offerings are indicated by the general disqualification, and there is no need to emphasize the law with regard to a sin offering, even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So since it wasn't necessary in Tractate Zevachim, why is it necessary here? We don't need to emphasize that even according to Rabbi Shimon. So is that the reason why? If so, then why are we doing it? And if that's not the reason why, well, then what's the other reason having nothing to do with Rabbi Shimon, right? Here too, with regard to meal offerings, since the Tana teaches the Mishnah with the term all, and he does not teach except, this means that all of them are indicated, even the meal offering of a sinner. Why then does this Mishnah specifically mention the meal offering of a sinner? And the Gemara explains, it was necessary to teach the Mishnah in this manner, as it might enter your mind to say, since I've established that the first clause, i.e. the first Mishnah on page 2a, with regard to the last clause as well, i.e. the Mishnah here, since I established the first clause, meaning the Mishnah on page 2a, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon did not agree with our first Mishnah, because he said that a meal offering where the priest removed a handful not for its own sake would nevertheless be fit, whereas the majority said no, if he took it out the handful with the wrong meal offering in mind, it is rendered unfit. It's valid. Rabbi Shimon said it would still satisfy the obligation of the sinner, but the majority said it will not satisfy the obligation of the sinner. That was the difference in the first Mishnah. So since that one was established visibly not in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, which we didn't have in the first Mishnah of Tractate Zevachim, that's why here in Menachot we needed to say even according to Rabbi Shimon in the second Mishnah, right? Since I've established that the first Mishnah was not in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, so then with regard to this Mishnah as well, we have to establish, it may be concluded that it is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. We might have thought that. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us the law in this manner to emphasize that it is in accordance even with Rabbi Shimon. Okay, next topic. Rav says, in the case of a non-priest who removed a handful, he should return the handful to the meal offering. Right? So this is like Ben Beseira said you could fix a disqualification where you took it out with your left hand by putting it back in and now removing it with your right hand. So now Rav seems to be offering a way to fix a disqualification, not in the case of a priest who removed with his left hand instead of his right, but a case where a non-priest came and removed the handful. Right? Rav says in the case of a non-priest who removed a handful, he should return the handful to the meal offering. Which seems to suggest, and then a priest will come and remove it the way it should have been done. So the Gemara challenges. But we learned in the Mishnah that a non-priest disqualified the meal offering by removing a handful from it. How could Rav say that he should just put it back? And the Gemara responds, what does the Mishnah mean when it says disqualified? It means that the non-priest has disqualified the meal offering until such time as he returns the handful to the meal offering, whereupon a priest who is fit for the temple service should again remove a handful from the meal offering and sacrifice it. Well, this would suggest maybe that's not only the case of a non-priest, but maybe if a tamei priest removed a handful, maybe he can put it back and then a non-tamei priest can come along and do it. Is that what we're saying? Let's keep reading. So the Gemara challenges this. If so, then this is identical to the opinion of Ben Beseira in the Mishnah, who says that if a priest removed a handful with his left hand, it is returned to the meal offering, whereupon the priest removes a handful from the offering with his right hand. What difference is there between the two opinions in the Mishnah? And the Gemara explains, if the handful that was removed by one unfit for temple service is in its unadulterated form, then the rabbis do not disagree with the opinion of Ben Beseira, and the handful is returned to the meal offering. If by removing it, you didn't change it, right? Taking it out with the left hand doesn't change it. You can put it back in and not remove with the right hand. Likewise, if a non-priest took it out, he didn't change it, he can put it back. Maybe that would be to the exclusion of a tameh priest, who maybe, but because he's tameh, could render the flour tameh. So let's keep reading. Where they disagree is when the handful is lacking. So the rabbis hold one does not bring flour from within his house and refill the vessel containing the handful, whereas Ben Beseira holds that one brings flour from within his house and refills it. This would suggest that if you took out with your left hand and now you put it back, okay, but if that was the complete measure, there's still some flour on your hand. You need to top it off. So Ben Beseira seems to be saying, well, you can top it off by bringing some more flour. But the majority maybe don't agree with that. The Gemara asks, if so, the Mishnah is referring to a handful that is lacking, well, then the statement of the Mishnah that Ben Beseira says he must return the handful to the vessel with the meal offering and again remove a handful with his right hand is imprecise. As the Mishnah should have taught, Ben Beseira says he must return the handful to the vessel with the meal offering and bring flour from within his house and refill the missing amount and again remove a handful with his right hand. But it didn't say that. The Gemara therefore suggests a different answer. When Rav said that the handful is returned to the meal offering, he said this only according to the opinion of Ben Beseira. So the Gemara asks, but isn't it obvious that this is the opinion of Ben Beseira? Why does that need further clarification? The Gemara responds that Rav's statement is necessary lest you say that Ben Beseira deems the meal offering fit only when the handful was removed with one's left hand, but with regard to other disqualifications, he does not deem it fit. Therefore, what Rav is teaching us is that with regard to all the disqualifications cited in the Mishnah, Ben Beseira holds that the handful is returned to the meal offering, whereupon a new handful is removed from it and sacrificed upon the altar, and seemingly would also require topping it off, because there's some that got left on your hand. And the Gemara asks, what is different in a case of a handful removed with a priest's left hand that one might have thought that Ben Beseira's opinion applies only in this case? Perhaps the reason is that we find that the temple service performed with the priest's left hand is fit on Yom Kippur, i.e. when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, holding the vessel containing the incense in his left hand. But with regard to a non-priest as well, we find that the temple service is fit with regard to slaughter, as an offering may be slaughtered by a non-priest. Right? We've learned that many times when we're talking about animal offerings. The shechting, the slaughtering, is not a sacrificial rite. It's necessary, but it can be performed by a non-priest. Whereas collecting the blood in a service vessel, conveying it to the altar and sprinkling it, that can only be done by a priest. Removing the handful, as we've learned, can only be done by a priest. Therefore, it is a sacrificial rite. So why then is it necessary for Rav to teach that the opinion of Ben Beseira applies to the case of a non-priest as well? And the Gemara responds, slaughter is not considered a sacrificial rite, and it is for that reason that a non-priest may slaughter an offering. Accordingly, without the statement of Rav, one would not have concluded that Ben Beseira holds that a handful removed by a non-priest may be returned, as the temple service is never fit when performed by a non-priest, right? If you slaughter by a non-priest, okay. But if an animal is shechted by a non-priest, if the blood is collected by a non-priest, fully disqualified, no correction. The Gemara asks, and is slaughter really not considered a sacrificial rite? But doesn't Rabbi Zera say that Rav says the slaughter of the red heifer by a non-priest is not valid? Now, the red heifer, is that a sacrifice? Not in the sense that a red heifer is never offered on the altar. In fact, it's not even killed in the courtyard of the Holy Temple. It's killed on the Mount of Olives opposite the Temple Mount, right? Outside the city of Jerusalem, but facing the temple, because the red heifer has to be slaughtered in a very precise manner. in order that it can then be burned, and the ashes of the red heifer are mixed with the waters of sprinkling to create the water of purification for a person who's come into contact with the dead by like walking over a grave or going to a funeral, helping to bury. For him to then be able to enter the temple, he has to go through that purification of tumas mace, of corpse tuma. Okay, but what's the point here? The one who slaughters the red heifer, can he be a non-priest? Rav says the slaughter of a red heifer by a non-priest is not valid. And Rav said with regard to this law, this is because the term Elazar the priest in Numbers 19:3 and the term statute in Numbers 19:2 are written in the Torah's description of the slaughter of the red heifer. And the term statute indicates that if one deviates from any of the details of the service as delineated in the verses, the service is not valid. So therefore it would seem like a priest has to slaughter the red heifer, therefore indicating that slaughter is a sacrificial rite. But the Gemara answers the laws of the red heifer are different, as the red heifer is considered sanctified for the purpose of temple maintenance. Right? It's needed for rites that are carried on in the temple to purify people so they can enter the temple, but it's not a sacrifice in itself. It's not brought to the altar. Accordingly, one cannot derive from the case of the red heifer that the slaughter of an offering is considered a sacrificial rite. And the Gemara asks, but is it not all the more so? If items sanctified for the purpose of temple maintenance require that the performance of rites relevant to them be performed by a member of the priesthood, then with regard to items sanctified for sacrifice upon the altar, should they certainly all the more so, kal v'chomer, require that their rites be performed by a member of the priesthood? This would have suggested that slaughtering must be done by a priest. Now we don't, that's not the law, but why not? Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said in response, the requirement that the red heifer be slaughtered by a priest is not proof that its slaughter is a sacrificial rite. Rather, that requirement is just as it is in the case of examination of the shades of tsaras, which has to be done by a priest, right? Those lesions on the skin that result from the malady known as tsaras, which is a physical expression of a spiritual malady, which no longer exists since the temple was destroyed. But when it did exist, it had to be declared tsaras by a priest. Only a priest could examine it and say that is tsaras. So this is just as in the case of examination of the shades of marks of tsaras, which is obviously not considered a sacrificial rite, and yet the Torah requires that these marks be examined by a member of the priesthood. Meaning there are things that have to be done by priests, doesn't mean that they are sacrificial rites. The Gemara asks, nevertheless, why was it necessary for Rav to teach that the removal of a handful by a non-priest does not disqualify the meal offering according to Ben Beseira? Let us derive it from the fact that there was a period of fitness for rites performed by a non-priest, as before the construction of the temple, it was permitted for non-priests to sacrifice offerings upon a private altar. And if you would say that we do not derive laws of the rites performed in the temple from those performed on a private altar, one could respond, but isn't it taught in a baraisa? From where is it derived with regard to an item? For example, the limbs of an offering that emerged from the temple courtyard and was thereby rendered unfit for service upon the altar. Now, right, rendered unfit, it should not go up on the altar. But if, nevertheless, it was placed on the altar, that we don't then take it down, right? Because the altar is able to sanctify certain things. If it was originally fit for the altar, like the limb of a sacrifice, it was then rendered unfit because it was removed from the courtyard. Then it was brought back. By mistake, they put it on the altar. We leave it on the altar because the altar will sanctify it. It should have been placed there, but now that it was, it stays there. Why? Because it was originally fit for the altar. But something that was never fit for the altar, if it was erroneously placed there, we would take it off. And how do we know that? It is derived from the fact that an item that emerged from the courtyard is valid for sacrifice on a private altar. And this indicates that one can learn the laws of offerings in the temple from the laws of a private altar. Gemara says, no. The Tana of that baraisa relies on the verse, this is the law of the burnt offering, from which it is derived that any item that ascends upon the altar shall not descend from it, even if it was disqualified. In other words, the verse is the source for the law of the Baraisa, whereas the case of a private altar is cited merely as support for this ruling. Therefore, we can't use the law of a private altar for other cases necessarily. The Gemara asks, rather, the reason it is known that Ben Beseira permits the return to the meal offering of a handful removed by a non-priest. Mishna just said Ben Beseira permits the return of a handful that was removed with the left hand. Rav apparently is telling us that he would permit the return as long as it wasn't adulterated in some way. Even a non-priest who removed it, we could put it back. Rather, the reason that it is known that Ben Beseira permits the return to the meal offering of a handful removed by a non-priest is that Rav taught us this, right? It's because Rav said so. Were it not for this, I would say that with regard to other disqualifications, i.e. other than the handful removed with the left hand, Ben Beseira would agree with the majority and invalidate the meal offering. But isn't it taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, both say Ben Beseira would deem fit in the case of all the other disqualifications listed in the Mishnah? Sounds like they follow Rav. Yeah, no, Ben Beseira would allow you to put it back. The Gemara, even if it was not just the case of the left hand. So the Gemara continues, and it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, and he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, and he shall remove from there his handful, that this verse indicates that the removal of a handful from a meal offering may be performed from the place where the feet of the non-priest stand, meaning anywhere in the temple courtyard. The Baraisa continues. Ben Beseira says that the verse should be interpreted as follows. From where is it derived that if one removed a handful with his left hand, that he must return the handful to the vessel with the meal offering and again remove the handful with his right hand? Where does Ben Beseira get that? It is derived from that which the verse states, and he shall remove from there, indicating that the handful is removed from the place where he already removed it, i.e. the handful is returned to the meal offering and thereupon removed from the same meal offering with the right hand. Right? That we get this in a Baraisa. That wasn't expressly stated in our Mishnah. But the Gemara explains the difficulty from that Baraisa. And since the verse is written in an unspecified manner, i.e. it does not mention which handfuls are returned, what difference is it to me if the handful was removed with the left hand, and what difference is it to me if it was removed by one of the other by means of one of the other disqualifications? If you can remove it and then return it, why is it only in the case of the left hand that you can return it? Why not the case of a non-priest? So the Gemara therefore suggests an alternative explanation. Rather, this is what Rav is teaching us. Ben Beseira holds that if one unfit for temple service removed a handful, it may be returned to the meal offering, even if he sanctified the handful by placing it in a service vessel. And the statement of Rav serves to exclude the opinion of these other Tanaim. As it is taught in the Baraisa, Rabbi Yosef ben Yassian and Rabbi Yehuda the baker said, in what case is this statement of Ben Beseira said, i.e. in which case does he rule that the handful may be returned to the meal offering? It is in a case where the unfit individual removed a handful and did not sanctify it. Okay, he took it out, but he didn't put it in a service vessel. Remember that once you take it out, the handful, you don't throw it on the altar. Rather, you sanctify it by placing it in a service vessel. Then you take that service vessel to the altar and pour that on the altar pyre, on the fire on the altar. So now they're introducing a new distinction. Okay, somebody unfit for service, or he took it with the left hand, or he was sitting when he did it, that would render it unfit. But did he first put it in a service vessel and then we're going to return it to the measure of the meal offering? Or did he take it out with his hand and then before putting the service vessel, he put it back? Right? Sounds like Ben Beseira would allow him to put it back even if it went in the service vessel. These other sages would say, no, only if he took it out and then put it back. But once it goes in the service vessel, it's too late. But if he sanctified it first by putting it in the service vessel, he has disqualified it, even according to Ben Beseira, according to those sages, and it may not be returned to the meal offering. And there are those who say that Rav teaches the opposite, that if an unfit person merely removed a handful, yes, Ben Beseira permits such a handful to be returned to the meal offering from which it was removed. But if he already sanctified the handful by placing it inside a service vessel, then no, it may not be returned, and therefore the meal offering is unfit. In accordance with whose opinion is this explanation? It is in accordance with the opinion of these Tanaim, i.e. Rabbi Yosef ben Yassian and Rabbi Yehuda the Baker, and it is to exclude the opinion of the first Tana in that Baraisa who disagrees with the ruling of Rabbi Yosef ben Yassian, and Rabbi Yehuda the Baker maintains that a handful may be returned even after it was sanctified by a service vessel. Rav Nachman objects. He objects to this. He says, what do these Tanaim of the Baraisa hold? If they hold that the removal of a handful by one who is unfit for temple service is considered the performance of a sacrificial rite to the extent that it disqualifies the offering, right? Again, think, when we were talking about animal offerings, if it was shechted by a non-priest, no problem, because it's not a sacrificial rite. Shechting can be done by a non-priest. But if the blood was collected by a non-priest, that offering is disqualified, because collecting the blood, conveying it, or sprinkling it, those are the sacrificial rites. So here, if taking the handful is a sacrificial rite, and that's done by a non-priest, disqualified. Right? If they hold that removal of a handful by one unfit for temple service is considered the performance of a sacrificial rite to the extent that it disqualifies the offering, then the meal offering should be disqualified, even though he did not perform this stage of the placement of the handful in a vessel. What difference does it make whether it went into a service vessel? If taking the handful is a sacrificial rite, then at the time that that's done by non-priest, it's over, disqualified. What difference does it make whether it then was placed in a service vessel or not? And if they hold that the removal of the handful by an unfit individual is not considered the performance of a sacrificial rite, then when he performed the stage of its placement in a vessel, what significance was there to this action? He can still return the handful to the meal offering. I don't follow that, because if we say that taking the handful is not a sacrificial rite, but putting it in the service vessel is, well then that would be the reason you can't put it back, because now it's been placed into the sacrificial vessel by one unfit for service. But let's keep reading. So Rav Nachman reconsidered and then said, actually, those Tanaim hold that the removal of a handful by one unfit for temple service is considered a sacrificial rite. So at that point already, it's a sacrificial rite. But the rite of the handful is not complete until he performs the stage of its placement in a vessel. Consequently, the meal offering is disqualified only after a person unfit for temple service places the handful inside a service vessel. It's one complete action. Take it out, put it in the service vessel. Until you complete that whole thing, you haven't disqualified it. Until an unfit person has done that whole action, take it out and put it in the service vessel, we haven't disqualified the meal offering. And the Gemara challenges this analysis. If so, if the placement of the handful inside a service vessel completes the sacrificial rite that begins with the handful's removal, then, even if the handful was removed by an unfit individual who has not yet sanctified it in a service vessel designated for the handful, when he returns the handful to its proper place in the service vessel that contains the meal offering, it should become sanctified, as it is now placed inside a service vessel. And it should therefore become disqualified. And it should not matter whether the handful was placed in a vessel designated for it or back in the same vessel it was taken from. Fascinating. Since the measure, when we first measure the amount for the meal offering, that's a service vessel. It's already been in a service vessel. So if you take out a handful and then you're like, ooh, I shouldn't have done that, I'm unfit, or I wasn't standing up, or I didn't have my feet on the temple floor, or I'm tameh, whatever, I'm going to put it back. Well, where did I put it back to? A service vessel. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Concerning this challenge, Rabbi Yochanan said, that is to say, that service vessels sanctify items placed in them only when they are placed there with specific intent that they be sanctified by that vessel. Since the priest does not return the handful to the vessel containing the meal offering with such intent, the handful is not disqualified because the rite was not completed. And the Gemara asks, it may be inferred from this statement that if items are placed into service vessels with intent, the service vessels sanctify them. But didn't Reish Lakish raise a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan? What is the law with regard to a service vessel? What is the law with regard to service vessels? I.e., do they sanctify disqualified items to the extent that they may be sacrificed upon the altar ab initio? Something that was disqualified but was nevertheless placed in a service vessel. Does the service vessel sanctify it so that it can complete its journey? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him that they do not sanctify the items. And the Gemara responds, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said to him. They do not sanctify the disqualified items that are placed inside them to the extent that they may be sacrificed. But they do sanctify them to the extent that they are disqualified. It's a significant action putting them in the service vessel, so that if they shouldn't have been placed there, they're now disqualified. So Rav Amram says, even if the service vessels sanctify items without specific intent, it is possible to return the handful to the meal offering without the vessel sanctifying the handful, such as in a case where he returned it to a heaped bowl. Right? There was a lot in the service vessel, more than the service vessel perhaps should have held. So there was excess there. I.e., he placed the handful upon the heap of flour in such a manner that the handful did not enter the airspace of the vessel containing the meal offering. Consequently, the handful is not sanctified by the vessel. But if the meal offering was heaped, how was he initially able to remove a handful from it? The handful must initially be removed from within the vessel. He can't take off the top, right? So if there's still a top, how did he get in there? Rather, it is possible to return the handful without sanctifying in a case where he returned it to a full bowl, i.e. was full to the brim, but not heaped. When the priest initially removes a handful from such a vessel, he removes it from inside the vessel, but when it is returned, it does not enter the airspace of the vessel. He went in, took out, it got looser, it's still full, he put it back on top, it didn't go into the airspace of the vessel. And the Gemara asks, but once he removed the handful, he formed a furrow in the surface of the meal offering, and therefore when he returns the handful to its previous place inside the vessel, he is in fact returning it to a spot inside the airspace of the vessel, i.e. the furrow. If so, the handful should be sanctified to the extent that the vessel disqualifies it. And the Gemara responds, when he returns it to the vessel containing the meal offering, he does not place it directly in the furrow. Rather, he lays it on the wall of the vessel and moves the vessel, and the handful falls by itself in the furrow, and in this manner it is as though a monkey, rather than a person, returned the handful to the furrow, and the handful is therefore not sanctified. They're definitely pushing the law to its extremes to identify a case where it would be possible to put it back without sanctifying it in the vessel, and it's not sanctified to the extent that you could take something, disqualify it, and requalify it, but it's sanctified to the extent that you did a significant action by putting it in the service vessel, and that's enough to disqualify the offering. That's where we will stop. There are no questions or comments. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Good Vach, Shavuot Tov.